Is Chainsaw Man Part 2 really that different from Part 1? Lately you'll see people here and there, even some YouTubers, say that Part 2 is dramatically different from Part 1, or Part 2 is drastically different from Part 1. And whenever I see this kind of take, I kind of just turn around to make sure I'm not the only one seeing this. But in fact, I am not, because then there will be people who respond and agree that Part 2 is dramatically different. Now, what stands out to one person may be unnoticeable to another person. So I asked people on Twitter and on YouTube whether they think Part 2 is in fact dramatically different. The responses I received can basically be compiled into three major claims. The first one claims that Chainsaw Man is now a rom-com, which ironically is a pretty dramatic claim to begin with. Like, I don't think most people would seriously say this, but there are those people who really like Part 1 and hold Part 2 to that same standard. So on that point, we kinda have to decide what genre Part 1 falls under. And that's the weird part, because you could technically place it under a lot of genres, but since this is an action series in Shonen Jump, and these kinds of manga tend to generally touch on a lot of genres, the conventional answer would be to designate it as a battle series or a battle shonen. The main reason being that most of the plot centers around fights, there's all kinds of wacky transformations, and the transformations and abilities stem from a power system. Okay, so now that we cleared that up, now we can look at Part 2 and be like, is it still a battle shonen, or is it really just a rom-com? Well, rom-com is another funny one because lots of stories have elements of romance and comedy. For example, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse has these elements. But if you go on Twitter and say Across the Spider-Verse is your favorite rom-com of 2023, expect people to inquire about your problems with drug abuse. Because at the end of the day, that movie is still a superhero movie. Call it an action movie or an adventure movie, but it is still a movie about a superhero who fights bad guys and has all of the same basic conventions as the other Marvel movies. And when we look at Part 2, the same is true. At the end of the day, it is still a battle series. Its plot still centers around fights and action. It is still governed by the same power system, and it has even more wacky transformations and abilities. If it looks like a battle series, walks like a battle series, and talks like a battle series, then it's pretty safe to say that Chainsaw Man is still a battle series. Just because there's more romance due to the dynamic between Asa and Denji does not mean the fundamental structure of the story has changed. Part 1 is full of comedy and has plenty of romance, but no one in their right mind would seriously call it a rom-com. Now, there is something to say about Asa and Denji in Part 2, because as I myself have said in previous videos, changing main characters also changed the story. But before I say more on this second claim, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, like I've said before, switching from Denji to Asa changed the story, but not as much as people think. Of course, there's people who say that Denji's still the main character and the story is still the same, but then you have people saying that Part 2 is dramatically different now that Asa is the main character, and I just have a hard time agreeing with that. We've already talked about how the basic structure of the story is still the same. There is the issue of pacing, but that's not really because of Asa, so we'll get to that in a few minutes. So the question becomes, how does the main character influence the story? And the simple answer is that they serve as our lens into the world. In other words, their actions and perspectives influence the setting and overall tone of the story. They quite literally set the tone. Of course, it's not a one-way road. The setting of a story also influences the main character, but it goes both ways. It all comes down to where the author wants to take the story and how. Which brings us to our question. Where is Fujimoto taking the story now that he's changed main characters? Well, I've seen a bunch of different answers, but one of the best ones comes from my boy Townsy. Townsy says, quote, "It tackles a kid going through their traumas at a different angle. In short, Part 2 strongly parallels Part 1. They tell the same basic story told from different perspectives. Slight differences, but nothing worthy of being deemed dramatic." So let's start with the biggest difference. Denji is a boy and Asa is a girl. Where we see the implications of that is in their pursuits for romantic relationships. When it comes to Denji, he always seems to be focused on getting with girls, for a lack of a better term. To put it another way, he's not exactly concerned with whether the girl in front of him is the right girl. He just knows that she's a girl. Of course, he matures a bit throughout the story, but that pretty much sums it up. On the other hand, Asa is interested in genuine relationships. She's more worried about planning the perfect date, for example, and gets very upset when Denji tells her that her date plans suck. And when Denji tells Asa that life is worth living because of sex, she couldn't be more disgusted. But at the same time, they are still each pursuing romantic relationships. They're both seeking meaning and intimacy, it's just that their headcanon of what that looks like is different. And the same goes for their goals and motivations. They both come down to their identity, but in different ways. With Denji, it's all about his dreams. In part 1, he has to figure out what that is. By the end, he decides that he doesn't just want a normal life. He wants all things, whether it's eating steak every night, meeting lots of girls, or just doing whatever he wants. But Asa is different. With Asa came Yoru, and with Yoru came inner dialogues. And the topic they seem to have over and over is when is it okay to kill people, and what makes a person a good person versus a bad person. In this way, Asa's self-perception of her own identity is revealed in how she views others. Whenever she talks about the people around her, it tends to be with the implication that she is somehow better than them. You can see it as early as chapter 1 when she makes comments to herself about the other students. You can see it in the way she mocks Chainsaw Man when she meets Denji. And of course you can see it in the interactions between her and Denji. Her motivations and perceptions are guided by right and wrong. In other words, through her ethics. On the other hand, Denji is guided more by his morals. And yet, they're two sides of the same coin. Morals and ethics are different, and yet they're similar enough that many people often have trouble telling you the difference. So when I see people saying that Asa and Denji are dramatically different, or part 2 is dramatically different because of Asa, this is why I can't agree, even though people have a good point. And on that note, I actually kind of agree with people on the third claim. Like I said before, this has to do with pacing. Pretty self-explanatory. It's the claim that pacing in part 2 is dramatically different from pacing in part 1. Now, if this were say, I don't know, 20 chapters ago maybe, then I might have agreed. But up until recently, the pacing has felt somewhat part 1-ish. Part 1 pacing is of course iconic for its chaos. I mean, Chainsaw Man pacing didn't become a meme for no reason. It's defined by romance, action, death, character growth, and some kind of wacky nonsense, all taking place in a single chapter. And that was pretty much the standard all through part 1. This was reflected in how minor characters and some important characters would die left and right. So when this changed in part 2, fans noticed right away. Suddenly the story seemed to have slowed down a bit, with characters being introduced and taken out of the story more deliberately. So in this sense, part 2 is clearly different from part 1 in the pacing department. And yet, the pacing recently feels all too familiar. It's kind of all over the place ever since we met the Falling Devil, and with no obvious direction. Which is ironic considering we were finally given an idea of part 2's end goal from Fami. And yet, in the here and now, at least when I'm reading it, I literally have no idea what's going on in this arc. Which feels more like the chaotic pacing of part 1. Plus, there's still as much action and still as much wacky nonsense as there is in part 1. So while I think pacing is the element that's changed the most, I still have a hard time saying it's dramatically different. At least right now, anyway. And that's why I just don't think part 2 is dramatically different like people are saying. When you look at the story structure, it's still basically the same as in part 1. When you look at the main character, there are clear differences, but the story arc of this character's strongly parallels Denji's. While there are some differences between part 1 and part 2, it really seems like a stretch to call them dramatic. But maybe I'm wrong. How would you say Chainsaw Man's changed in part 2? Would you say there's been dramatic changes? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another Chainsaw Man discussion like this one, then check out my recent video on Denji. In that video, I analyzed Denji's character growth in part 2. You can find it in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.